Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, curator of the museum's collections. Yeah, so we're really excited today. We're going to be talking to Dolly Jørgensen, who is a professor of environmental humanities at the University of Stavanger. She's legendary in the world of environmental history and animal history. So we're very excited to be talking to her about medieval pigs, one of her great loves and specialisms, but probably we'll touch on a few other things too.
I must say this conversation emerged from an email with the subject line, medieval piggies.
You can't go wrong there.
No, you really can't. So yeah, thrilled to be sharing this with you and hope you enjoy.
Yeah.
Welcome to the podcast, Dolly Jørgensen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dolly, you contacted us when you heard about the podcast. You mentioned Absolute Units, and you have just produced a book, I think, last year called The Medieval Pig, which resonates so powerfully with the theme of some of the stuff we've done on the podcast so far. Obviously, it's dragging me totally out of my comfort zone because I'm familiar with cows and I'm familiar with sheep, but I have next to no knowledge about hands-on management of pigs. But could you maybe kick off by telling us just a little bit about what pigs are like in medieval life, how they feature in people's lives, where are they, what do they look like?
Yeah.
Is it really that different to pigs today?
Absolutely. So we can start there because I am thrilled to be on your podcast. Even though I live in Norway, I have visited the Merle, as any good agricultural historian would do, and was of great interest that you were talking absolute units and wanted to talk about some pigs. Because yes, I wrote a book about medieval pigs. And so thinking about how are they different than modern pigs? I mean, the first thing is they kind of look different. So most of the pig breeds that we're used to seeing today, they're going to be really large, tend to be that we think of them as kind of pink or light colored. If you think of
like Babe.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think of Babe in the movie, right? It's that very kind of smooth. I mean, they have hair, but kind of smooth looking pink pig. But that isn't a medieval pig. Those pigs show up much later in the early modern period. Medieval pigs look a lot more like wild boar. And it's not that they were the same as wild boar. They weren't. They just hadn't been bred specifically for traits that people will end up breeding for later. Because things weren't as commercialized as they become. So they tended to be more hairy, with longer kind of bristly hair, the way wild boar are. They tended to have longer snouts, the way wild boar do. They were skinnier than pigs are today, kind of lankier, longer legs, and kind of, skinnier body. But, and this is the kicker, they were domestic pigs because they had curly tails. So this is a thing that happens. So geneticists have looked at this. Curly tails is a trait that comes with breeding, making domestic pigs out of,
is it a purposeful trait?
No. So it is one of those things.
What's that utility? Was that utility?
No, so it isn't. But it's one of those traits that comes with kind of inbreeding. In that you're breeding things together, you're getting kind of a specific genetic line that develops.
So the curly tail is like the Habsburg chin of the pig breeding world.
Exactly. When you see a drawing in the ancient world and the medieval world, if the pig has a curly tail, it's because the person who saw pigs, they saw domestic pigs.
Oh, okay.
And so that's why they're drawing what they're drawing. That
enables you to distinguish them from boar. Then,
that's exactly right.
In the art.
Exactly right. So wild boar will have like flat tails that go down. So it's one of those like quirks that can be a nice quiz thing to know that domestic pigs have curly tails.
That's a great fact, isn't it? Pub quiz fact.
So Joe has been, I think we're using the term posting hog on the museum socials, and you may have seen that. And it's a Berkshire pig, and it dates to the 1870s, and it's a portrait of a Berkshire pig. Now, the Berkshire, I think, is one of the oldest British sort of traditional breeds of the modern period. And actually, it has got black hair. It looks a little bit more like, I think, the medieval pigs that you're describing, but it's still much bigger and rounder, and, it's a substantial beast.
Right.
These seem like a strange thing to get into. And, I mean, obviously, you're a medieval historian, you're an environmental historian, there's that connectivity to nature, to the wider environment and how people are living in the world. But what drove you to write a book specifically about pigs? Is that because they're so ubiquitous in the record? Or
How did you get into pigs?
Yeah, so
explore, I think.
It is that they become ubiquitous, or I saw them everywhere. So a little over 20 years ago, I was writing a master's thesis about forestry management in the Anglo-Norman Kingdom from 1066 to 1135, so England and Normandy. And in the forestry management, what I saw a lot of times was that people were concerned about pigs. They had pigs who roamed around in the forest, particularly in the fall. They would pay for that privilege in terms of pigs. It's called pannage. So you generally pay 1 out of every 10 pigs that you'd have in the forest as your payment to the landholder, which wasn't you. They show up in important records like the Doomsday Book, and that's how some of the woodlands anyway are measured, is by how many pigs could feed there. So I kept seeing this over and over again, and then few years after that, I wrote a PhD thesis that was actually on urban sanitation. So how you keep a city clean, what you do to clean up the streets, how you handle waste. But again, pigs were showing up. So pigs needed to be managed in the city. They would set up regulations and have sheriffs and other deputies who would arrest pigs, if you will, that were roaming around, and then you'd have to find out who the owner was. If you didn't know who the owner was, to give them a fine.
And these are put in a pig pound, aren't they? They're put in animal pounds or rounded up.
Basically, yeah. So you would either give the pig back because the person would kind of redeem it for a fine. But most of these towns had regulations in England that were that the person who found the pig could kill it and could sell it, and they got to keep half the money, and then half the money went to the city. So in other words, it was a way of keeping pigs off the streets. And so, and then there were the butchery wastes, since I was writing a PhD that was about, how you handle waste in big part. Things like, well, what do you do with the fact that pigs get slaughtered and you have a lot of entrails and material, blood that you need to take care of and dispose of. So pigs were showing up there too. And so I decided that, well, those two things put together meant that I really needed to write a book about pigs.
So pigs have sought you out in a way rather than you seeking them out. They've followed you around throughout your historical research, and yeah, that's pigs exerting their agency over
you. A spectre is haunting Dolly.
Yeah,
absolutely, exerting their agency. I mean, that's a really important part about pigs, and one of the things that I really love about thinking with them in the Middle Ages is that they are animals that are very smart. They are rather large, even in the Middle Ages. They're still not small animals, it's not like a rabbit or something. And they're pretty interested in getting food. So, and being omnivorous, they'll eat just about anything. So they have a tendency in the records to end up getting in trouble because they're out and about where they shouldn't be.
So in the book, and I enjoyed the book. It's an amazing book. You touch on some quite gruesome things that pigs end up doing, and sort of killer pigs that end up doing quite brutal things, and animal trials. And there's a brilliant line in there: animal trials imbued pigs with a legal personhood. The basic assumption was that pigs had rationality and could take responsibility for their actions. Now, this seemed to me, when I was reading it, like the sort of perfect metaphor for some of the wider work that you and your fellow historians and environmental humanities scholars have brought about in terms of that turn where we're thinking about animals having agency, bringing about changes, influencing the past. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about that idea of agency. What does that mean in terms of your research, and how does that come through? Because it feels like we've kind of lost that sense of animals as having that sentience, that personhood, and we're kind of coming back to it just now. I mean, I know the French have voted some years back now to sort of recognise the sentience of animals. We're beginning to recognise that in animal welfare contexts and sort of livestock breeding contexts in the UK. You know, but there seems to be a big chunk of time when that wasn't the case. But in the medieval period, clearly they're relating to animals in this way that feels quite now. You know, is that true? Am I misreading that?
No, I mean, I think that one of the things about the medieval period is that animals were really present in people's lives. I mean, they still actually are. If we think about modern life, pets. If you actually like do a survey, many people have dogs and cats, right? So they're actually everywhere.
Maybe the occasional Vietnamese pot-bellied pig, but not that many absolute units, I think, wandering around households.
Exactly. So not that many, not that many pigs, no. But in the medieval period, then livestock were much more part of daily life, whether you lived in the countryside or in the city, because of you didn't have the animals out somewhere else, get slaughtered, and end up with meat coming to a grocery store like we do today. You needed to have it fresh. You didn't have refrigeration. You didn't have, ice coolers that were going to keep things from going bad. So you had a lot more animals that were around you. And in fact, you had a lot more animals around you through the beginning of the 1900s, because it wasn't until then that you really get those technologies like refrigerators that change the way we do food. So animals were just a more common part. And so you were familiar with them. You saw them.
It's striking to think about the role of inventions like the refrigerator. Like I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, and it's absolutely the case, because those kind of technologies are what permit us to be separated from animals. And so, so through the beginning of the 1900s, this was not the case. You needed to be quite close. I mean, another, transportation inventions, whether that's the steamship or railroads, also matter a lot in where you can have animals and where you can kill them and where you can eat them, right? So if we think about a much closer relationship, then people also pay attention, I think, more to how the animals are. You need to manage them in particular ways, and they need to have certain requirements met. So therefore, in other words, they need to have somewhere to live, they need to have something to eat, just like they do now. But more people saw it, and more people would know how they react to things as well. So in a medieval town, you might see pigs on the street, going with their swine herd out to pasture every day.
Circling back a bit, Dolly, you've talked a little bit about the urban context, and you've talked about the woodland context. Of course, presumably in the medieval period, lots and lots of people are living in rural spaces. I think we tend to think of them as far less populated. But how many? I mean, we're talking about very large numbers of pigs in some instances as well. I think I saw a reference in one bit of the book to someone who died leaving his wife with land with 2,000 swine, giving another 400 more to other family members who must have been pretty made up that they scored 400, and out of but that's 2,400 pigs, and that's one person's. That's one person's will. These are huge numbers of pigs. How many people are looking after that number of pigs? I mean, is there a sort of rough number of people, swineherds, who look after a particular number of pigs?
Not really, but we know that big landowners like that one that you mentioned would be pretty rare. I mean, there aren't that many people who are going to have large herds like this. And this actually is that kind of commercial thing, because although I say pigs live around everybody, they're in the cities. The benefit of pigs and pig meat in the Middle Ages is that it's very portable because it's salted in general. So if you think about bacon, right, you salt bacon. So you put it into brine.
We have a salting tray actually on display in the museum. So, we have some of that tech, albeit from a much later period. But, the objects don't change that much to deal with salting and sort of processing of meat. But
no, they don't. They don't. Because it works, right? They're a basic technology and they work. So those big herders, the ones who had a whole lot of pigs that they ran, it was because they had good feeding grounds for pigs. And so in those cases, they would sometimes they would have, slaughtering around where the feeding is. Sometimes they actually would march them on the hoof to somewhere else.
And is this the pannage that you're talking about? You talked about autumn time practice in the woodland, and I know this resonates actually with the Merrill's social media as well, because there was something
about pannage before.
Yeah. About Brat Summer's over. I think.
Oh yeah, pannage autumn. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the practice of taking them out in the fall. Particularly, you're going to feed the pigs on oak acorns or beech nuts, but other things that grow in the fall too. Pigs love mushrooms, for example. Other kinds of roots they'll dig up and eat. They'll actually, bracken. So they are often taken out then to get fat. Because what you want to do is you want to have not so many pigs that live over the winter, because you're going to have to give them food. And so typically in the medieval calendar, come November, December, you're going to do your slaughtering and then have your meat ready that you're going to be able to preserve by smoking or by salting. But some, of course, have to live over. So they also lived longer than today. Pigs now live very short lives. In the Middle Ages, when we look at archaeological finds, often pigs are 1.5 to 2 years old.
So I'm just mindful of what you said a minute ago about salting trays lasting, and they've lasted forever because they're useful. It makes me think, what was the reason why we kept so many pigs? Presumably, you've mentioned about pigs going out and eating bracken and things like that. What were the kind of uses of pigs that made them such an indispensable part of medieval life?
That's a great question, because a lot of the livestock that we have, if we think about, like Ollie just said about cows, he's a specialist in cows, most livestock has more than one thing that they do. So, you can milk a cow, but you can also have the beef, and you also have, of course, the leather. So they're quite useful on different levels. Pigs are pretty special as far as livestock go, because they aren't used in those other ways. They're pretty much just for the meat. You can make pig leather, but it's not used very often. It's just, if we look historically and the number of artifacts, it just doesn't come up that often that people liked pig leather. I don't think it has very good qualities. But No, exactly. So the you're using the pig for when it's dead. I mean, for killing it. I mean, which is different than a lot of other things, right? A chicken lays eggs. It can continue living its life. But so from a pig, you have the meat itself, so pork, which, as I said, primarily you would salt, and in fact is still today, right? Bacon is the primary way people consume pork. But you also rendered the fat, so you have lard, which is a regular thing in medieval recipes to use as your fat when you're cooking. Like if you think, oh, well, if I'm going to cook something on top of on a pan, I need to have some kind of fat often to cook it. So now we probably use a lot of butter and margarine, but then they used a lot of lard, so animal fat. So use that.
Yeah, we've fallen somewhat out of love with lard, haven't we? But there are traditional cakes in England that are made with lard.
Yes, exactly. So lardy cakes.
Yeah, and in Spain there are huge numbers of sort of traditional baked goods that are made using lard. It's still a big thing in lots of parts of the world, but just somehow we're pulling back from it more and more, aren't we?
Yeah. The one thing you still have too are hot water crust pies. So those are they're lard based. So if it's a standalone kind of pie that you can make that's filled, often that'll use lard because it's a different kind of fat than the milk based fats. But so you use that a lot out of pigs. And the other thing people used in the Middle Ages, they still do now, is blood. So blood sausage. Yeah. And blood pudding. And so it's very common in medieval images of pigs because, well, I guess I should back up. In medieval manuscripts often show pigs with two kind of scenes of agricultural work. One is when they're out feeding in the woodland, and the other is when you kill them. And so those end up to be kind of October and November, or November and December, as the scenes of what people do in the medieval.
So these are like in a sort of Book of Hours.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So these are agricultural signs, so that everybody would look at the picture and which month you're on in the calendar.
I think we have an image from one Book of Hours in the displays of the museum, but it's actually a threshing image. So they're, it's someone flailing crops. But I'm going to go back and find that one and have a look in the rest of it and see if we can find an image of a pig in it.
Would you quickly clarify what a Book of Hours is?
Yeah, so these were little prayer books that wealthy people, often women, had. And so they have a calendar at the front, which has pages for every month that indicates where the holidays are and which saints have each day. So because just like we know Christmas is on, for us, December 25th, and you have other holidays that belong to different saints. So Martinmas and Michaelmas, which you still use actually in Britain for your school terms. All of those are actually on a calendar. And so because they were every month, they would have a picture of some kind. And that picture then for threshing is going to be...
It's like my digital calendar, but enormously beautifully and lavishly decorated with scenes of bucolic existence.
By hand.
Much, much prettier, yeah. Exactly. Very nicely illustrated and often with very pretty gold leaf around to make it shiny. So they were really nice. But so often pigs are there. And so the image for December, a good portion of them will show the pig being slaughtered and blood being let from the pig in order to collect it. So that they'll have a pan there, and that's so that they can make blood sausage or blood pudding.
So when we joked on social media that Brat Summer would be followed by Panage Autumn, actually there is a long history of people identifying the autumn with Panage and pigs.
Absolutely.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And in some parts of the world, that kind of practice of putting pigs out in woodland is still common. So again, in Spain, where there's a huge amount of traditional jamón production, that culture of raising pigs specifically for the ham, they're doing it on the same thing. You know, they're putting them out in woodland. They're eating acorns. They rate them by acorns, bellotas. Wow. So a really high quality Spanish ham is 5 bellotas, five acorns.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's the highest acorn it could?
I think it is 5.
Is it 5?
I don't know.
Yeah.
And yes, and they were doing it in the Middle Ages too. So this is a really long-standing thing that Spain has continued to do because of the dehesa system, which has great kind of grasslands with oak trees on it, and that's where they take these pigs to that make the Iberian ham.
So this gets us to another of the sort of things that pigs can offer whilst they're still alive, rather than the various things that can be done to them after they're slaughtered. You touched briefly on waste recycling. You know, there's obviously stuff that they're doing to the soil and to the land that's really important, and part of that plays a part in contemporary conversations about how you rewild or regenerate soils, and pigs are they do things to soil, don't they, that are quite important.
Yes, absolutely. So pigs root around. So they dig with their nose. And that means that they have a tendency to turn over soil. They will also take away plants that grow with very shallow roots because they'll be dug up. They'll also eat saplings. So they keep a forest floor or woodland. I don't want to use forest. It's not like closed forest, but an open woodland. They'll keep it open because they'll kind of take down saplings. And yeah, as a recycler, because they're so flexible in what they eat as omnivores, like humans, they had a tendency to be fed leftovers. So often people like brewers would have a couple pigs at their brewery, because you end up with the dregs, right, when you make beer. And so instead of throwing all that away, which is kind of a mush that's made out of wheat or rye or barley or mix thereof, some hops thrown in maybe, you instead would feed it to the pigs. So you can do the same thing with letting them out into fields after they've been harvested, because there's always going to be grains or vegetables or fruits that you missed, or that fell down and you didn't take it, or that were damaged. Well, the pigs will come and eat them. And then you have
just your unit at home that we refer to as the pig for precisely this reason. Although it's a less useful way of dealing with the waste, I have to admit. It's not turning it into another kind of product. And yeah,
it is interesting to view that idea that pigs are taking scraps and they're taking things that would have been discarded otherwise and turning it into food.
Exactly. So they're taking that leftover food and making food. And in fact, I mean, this was commonly practiced through about the mid-1980s in most places, that you had pigs. So when I grew up in the U.S., our school district had a farm that had pigs. And all of the leftovers of the cafeteria would get sent down to the pig farm. Now, in about mid-1980s, people started getting really concerned about the hygiene of this and potential diseases like, foot and mouth is moving around and other things, trichinosis in pork. So that was stopped in most places. But it was practiced all the way until then. And in World War II, for example, there's an entire British thing of victory pigs where people
Please tell us more about Victory Pigs.
Victory Pigs, yeah. So there's some great images of Victory Pigs. You guys need to get them at the Merle.
Pig for Victory.
Yeah, at the Imperial War Museum. They have some posters and some pictures of. So the households would collect, your compostable waste, just like you do now. You have your compost, kind of all your food waste. At least we do, separate, in a separate bin, that then they take off to compost. Well, what they would do is they would come by with a truck, they would collect all that, and it was going to pig farms. And so this was part of your duty to help win the war, was to make sure you collected your compostable waste and turned it in to the truck when it came by.
So this gets me to something that I was going to ask you about. Obviously, over the course of the 20th century, we have this specialization in farming, and farms become monocultural in what they're doing. But I come from a farming family on both sides. So my mother and my father both grew up on farms. My mother on a dairy farm, my father on a mixed farm, but with arable and sheep and cattle. But both of them grew up with pigs. They grew up with one or two pigs for precisely the same kind of reason. You feed them the scraps. It's doing something useful with the scraps from the farmhouse. But this is something that's completely disappeared from most farming. So farming is now very specialized, and pigs generally are only on pig farms. And, unless you go near a pig farm, you don't come across pigs at all. This greater removal of pigs from our lives, this lack of familiarity, is that something that you think would be completely bizarre to medieval people? They'd be totally thrown by the lack of pigs in
where are the
both,
pigs?
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
yeah. I think they probably would be, because generally, right, the only time people see pigs now is if you go to one of the future farmers' farms, the 4-H kind of farm, where they have a pig, or if there happens to be a livestock show, you may see a pig. And in medieval towns, so in records that we have that survive from medieval England, it appears that about 1 in every 3 households had a pig on the kind of tax roll, tax rolls that show up, which is how...
That's a huge number of pigs.
Yeah. So, but I mean, you have one. And in fact, this was extremely common.
Unless you have 2,000.
Yeah, well, except for those people. But in a town,
Yes.
people basically, I think there were only a very small number that had over 3 pigs in the roll. So what you could see is, when you're talking about, I think this roll maybe had, a couple hundred taxpayers, and a third of them have a pig. Only a couple of them have a little mini herd of pigs, but most people, which means they probably were the breeders, but most people have 1 pig. And so what that is it's your Christmas pig, right? It's the pig that you feed all the scraps to all year long, and then you slaughter in the winter. And that is just an absolutely normal thing. And it was a normal thing through the beginning of the 1900s. So if you look at images of British cities from the late 1800s and early 1900s, if they're taking pictures, you will often realize that somewhere in the back there's a pig that's in that picture.
I was struck by, you're talking about swine herds and sty herds and the people who are looking after pigs. And I gather that this is the root of the word steward. So this runs right through contemporary farming payments. So the current sort of farm payments that you get from the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs are called stewardship payments. You get higher level stewardship payments, countryside stewardship payments, and the Sustainable Farming Initiative, which is also about stewardship. That concept of stewardship is directly rooted in this word, this terminology for people who look after pigs. And it's just bizarre that you have these sort of hangovers from a period when pigs were ubiquitous. They're part of everyone's lives. 1 in 3 people, 1 in 3 households had pigs. and yet, the closest you get to pigs these days is through popular culture or the supermarket.
And the language we use to talk about managing space, managing towns, words like stewarding, they relate to this era, and yet the history is gone, the language remains, and it's really interesting, I guess, seeing language as that artifact, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, because swine herds, so most towns, I won't say everyone, but many towns would have had a swine herd.
And
so the records, so the records indicate that often the town would kind of hire a town swineherd, who then would be the person who would take the pigs out. So, we have all these individual pigs, right, that people are having in their back garden. So if you think of tenement houses and kind of the back section, they'll have like a pig pen, so a sty. And the swineherds would come around and pick them up. People had their pigs marked, of course, like ear notches potentially would have been a common way to do that, and take them out when appropriate times were to eat.
Like the medieval equivalent of a dog walker.
Yes, well, exactly. Because they would go around and they would herd them all up. That's exactly it. And so these people were paid, and they had a really important job. They needed to keep an eye on and get these pigs to go where you want them to go. As I said, pigs are kind of smart. So
herding pigs.
Herding pigs.
People talk about herding cats, but perhaps herding pigs is the...
Absolutely. Really yes. And in fact, there are images of medieval pigs being herded. And so there's a couple of techniques that they would use and that they still used, even because I've seen images that are at the beginning of the 20th century of tying a rope to the back of one of the trotters so that it can't go too far from you as you're walking. So it's kind of like a leash, like exactly like a dog leash, but to their back foot. So that was a normal way that you would take a pig, and you had your stick. So all swineherds ever shown in medieval manuscripts always have a pigging stick that they used to herd the pigs. And
those pig sticks are pretty much the same as the sticks that people use today. So we have some in the collection.
Exactly.
That term a pig stick or a pig slapper sometimes, which is an
I was going to say, I have heard of pig slappers.
Yeah. Well, we have some pig slappers, and you can find them on the museum's database. But for guiding the pigs in a particular direction. What we don't have any of, I think, in the museum's collection are pig boards. I don't know whether they had those in the medieval period, but often when you're showing pigs, you use a board. It's a bit like
showing us in at
an agricultural show. You have a board and a pig stick or a pig slapper, and you're sort of steering it between the board this side, which blinkers the pig so it can't see past through the board. Right. And sometimes you have two-handed boards. I mean, that's presumably for extra large pigs. I don't know. I don't think we have any pig boards, but we do have pig sticks, and pretty much, I think I'm right in saying, Dolly, that the technologies haven't really changed that much. There's not that much, pig rings and big boards.
Exactly. The pig slappers that you have are very much like the images, the drawings that we have from the Middle Ages of exactly the same tool, this pig slapper, which is used to, you hit the side of the pig, right, with it to move it the right direction, to keep it going the way you want to go. But the other thing they use them for, and I don't know if they, continued to use it for this in the, in the period of when yours are collected, but in the medieval period, this same tool is used to knock down the acorns and the beech mast, because that's often shown in the images. Because of course it's a big stick, right? so you can easily hit the trees with it. And the other technologies are the same too. So you have in your catalog some nose rings, pig ringers. So this technology is the same as what was used in the Middle Ages. So the reason you put a nose ring in a pig is because you don't want it rooting around. So if you're going to have a pig in an urban space, for example, you don't want it to be digging up people's gardens. So what the ring does is it makes it where they can't get their snout to dig into the soil with a ring on. And so in certain cases, you don't want them doing that behavior. And that's what the nose ring is for.
It's just fortunate that pigs, aren't like crows and have learned how to use tools, because if they did, it would be game over for all of us, I think.
Yeah. If you liked your garden, you should have put a ring on it.
Well, there we go. So we're going to do another episode with you, Dolly, which we're very excited about sort of what pigs represent. And just before we finish this episode, I'd love to go back. We started talking about Babe, pig in the city. Is the astonishing thing about Babe less that Babe is the pig in the city, and more that there are not pigs in the cities today?
Is that not Babe 2, Pig in the City?
Yes, it is. It is Babe 2, Pig
I'm old
in the
enough
City.
to have read the book, so the sheep pig. I'm way back.
Pig,
Yeah. So that's right. It is. I mean, I think you nailed it when you said earlier that medieval people might be really surprised. I think they would if they were transported. There's of course a lot of things that are different about cities now than were then, but in general, they would be surprised by the lack of pigs and other livestock. Of course, horses would have been a very common thing in a medieval city, and we really don't have them very much today.
I can imagine medieval people coming to the Museum of English Rural Life and being very disappointed by the lack of pigs. Medieval people or just regular people today. Although we are bringing farm animals to the museum in early August for a family event, so that would be very nice.
Yeah, and you're doing a service by posting plenty of hog online. So we're bringing pigs to the people in other ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And through this podcast.
Yeah.
Pigs to the people.
Yeah. And pigs have come to me, a bit like pigs have chased Dolly throughout her career. This episode has brought pigs into my life in a much bigger way than
in a way, I suppose pigs brought us all together for this very conversation.
Yeah.
And as I say, we're very excited to be having a second conversation with Dolly, all about what pigs represent and the symbolism of pigs. And yes. So thank you very much, Dolly, and we'll pick up with you again very soon.
Thanks, guys.